most of that, at least in outline, is well settled. A number of authors and writers and teachers, allegedly operating out of what they call at least a Catholic perspective, or what they now call a Catholic presence, have come along and said, well, basically we have interpreted this all too narrowly in the past, and perhaps we have underrated or not sufficiently paid attention to the importance of this final consideration that is called proportion. And this has spawned a number of theories, moral theories, which sound somewhat like what we're talking about here, but actually are quite different. And that's a little rule of thumb we should keep in mind. Some people accomplish revolutions through what sounds like tinkering with language. We're only making a little change in wording or methodology, but we're always saying what Catholic tradition has always said. Beware of such types, particularly if all of a sudden, here in the middle of the 1980s, they end up justifying what Catholic tradition never justified. Usually, we have a little change in words there without a corresponding change in reality, and these little adjustments in words can become very important. Much of this goes back, to be quite frank, to the non-acceptance, the non-believing of the received teaching of the Church in the encyclical Humani Vitae, which was issued by Pope Paul VI on July 25th, 1968. At first, a number of theologians who had actually lobbied a great deal to get a different answer, but the Church can't give a different answer, but some of them had made their name and their fame by saying that the Church was wrong on this issue, or at least in a limited way, that in certain hard cases, in limit situations, in conflict situations, that somehow or other the immorality of contraceptive sterilization or artificial contraception was somehow different in that case. And there began, at least on the public level, a notion of dissent, as they said. Now this really involves other things as well. One's whole notion of the Church, what we call ecclesiology, that there is a teaching order in the Church, and we'll put that aside, although it's enormously important and cannot be forgotten. My little focus here is some began searching around for a new kind of theory, moral theory, which could justify their exceptions, so-called, and the dissent, as they labeled it. Some of them, in fairness to them, I don't think at the time they realized the language they employed involved far more of a radical change and a departure from received Catholic teaching than perhaps they even imagined themselves. This has come up under different terms. We'll call one the big C and the other the big P. The big C is called consequentialism, and the one under P would be proportionalism. Several things are at stake. One preliminary verbal caution. No Catholic author wanted to come on strong against or in favor, pardon me, no Catholic author wanted to come on strong in favor of or endorsing what is called situation ethics. Why? Because Pope Pius XII, back in 1952 and again in 1956, did such a clear job of analyzing what situation ethics is and why it's wrong, that no Catholic author really wanted to take that on. However, there are ways of ending up in the same ballpark without using the same terminology, and I'm about to show one such way, because basically that's what's at stake is intrinsic morality, whether that's intrinsic good or intrinsic evil, and basically what we come down to is situation ethics by another name. Normally that name will be consequentialism or proportionalism. What's going on? Basically, there was a German author by the name of Peter Knauer who wrote a doctoral dissertation, the title of which, I believe in German, is Recht Verstandene, the right understanding, der Prinzip double Wirkung als Grundnorm, the principle of double effect as the ground norm of every moral judgment. The ground norm of every moral judgment. Beware, we got a problem already. Remember before, with our principle of double effect, if it has multiple good resultancies, we don't need a fancy principle. If it's a single action with a single result, it doesn't apply to that. If it has two evil effects, it doesn't apply to that either. So that even in the title of his dissertation, when he says that this principle of double effect is the ground norm of every conscience decision, he has already overstated things. His point is rather simply this, that this notion of proportion in the traditional understanding of the principle of double effect has been underrated and underviewed and undervalued. And of course, in his terms, it is properly viewed and properly valued. But of course, unfortunately, he's wrong. What is his point? His point is basically that when you have a proportionate reason for doing what you're doing, then what might appear to be a direct killing, because of that proportionate reason, becomes an indirect killing. Or what appears to be a moral evil, if you have a proportionate reason for doing what you're doing, then becomes a physical evil. Now, if much of this sounds to you like double talk, you're right. Much of it is really double talk. But some double talk in very academic sounding language has the ability to persuade some people who want to be persuaded, but it has the ability also to confuse people who shouldn't be so persuaded. He gives an example. He says, say you have a pharmacist who is selling brand X, and along comes brand X plus one, which is a much better drug, many fewer side effects, and in fact cheaper. So this is an unreal example, but he's stocked up on brand X, and he keeps selling brand X, even though he knows brand X plus one is better and cheaper, but he wants to get rid of the stock that he has. Now, the question Father Knauer poses is this wrong? And he said, well, yes, this is wrong, because he doesn't really have a proportionate reason for doing what he's doing. His proportionate reason is rather base, merely to make more money or not suffer as much loss. So that he calls that a direct moral evil. But he'll take the same analysis and he'll turn it around. And you begin to see it yourself, that if you did have a proportionate reason for doing what you're doing, you, pardon me, you would not then be placing really a moral evil. Toward the end of his famous article, which was buried in his dissertation, Father Knauer is one of the few European moralists who is a defender of the legitimacy of capital punishment. Most European moralists presently do not see either the reasoning for it or the justification. But unfortunately, Father Knauer's justification is highly confused. His reason is, someone was guilty of a capital crime, they received a fair jury trial by jury, there was a correct sentence by the judge, then along comes the state to impose the penalty of capital punishment. His question is this a direct killing? And oddly enough, he answers no. Because he says, since the state has a proportionate reason for doing what she's doing, that makes this an indirect killing. Now, if I ever came across a direct killing in my life, it would seem to me that a capital punishment is a direct killing. After all, if you take the electrocution example, when you strap someone down into a chair and then put certain appliances to one's head, and then you up the voltage so that the amperage does what it's supposed to do, I mean, that is a direct killing. What's going on here? What's going on here is Father Knauer is getting a little bit confused about what the double effect analysis is about. One condition has to do with intentionality, and the third condition has to do with causality, and he's mixing them up because he's saying the presence or the absence of a good intention will change the causality from direct to indirect, and that's all garbled, although he buries it under the notion of proportion. He uses other examples which are more illustrative of how the example can go. He says it turns out that there is an obstacle to mother's health. The most efficient way to remove the obstacle to mother's health, the obstacle turns out to be an unborn child. Do you have a proportionate reason for doing what you're doing? He says for the purposes of mother's health, yes. So that whenever you have a proportionate reason, then all abortions become indirect and should fit with Catholic tradition. Now, I know he's not only off base, he's out of the ballpark. When we say a proportionate reason, of course, we're speaking from the point of view of the subject. So immediately we are into some kind of a subjectivism, because it is the subject, it is you, it is I. We are the ones who will figure out in our purview what is or is not a proportionate reason. And there's no way you can spell that out in objective criteria. And the presence or the absence of a proportionate reason will not undo reality. I mean, it will not make a direct killing indirect. Now, many other authors, the famous Father Fuchs from the Gregorian, will pick up on Knauer. Father McCormick in this country will pick up on Knauer, and they'll use different terms. But what it'll often come down to is something very close to this, that the presence or absence of a proportionate reason or a commensurate reason for doing something, say something we take as normally immoral, like adultery is wrong, adultery is immoral. They will insist that you really can't say, they'll accept that as a formal norm. I don't want to get buried too much in technical terminology, but let me spell that out a little bit. What's a formal norm? A formal norm is something like, thou shalt not commit adultery. It's a revealed norm. It's in Holy Scripture, both the Old Testament and the New. And they'll say, we do not disagree with that. On a formal level, everybody accepts that. But they'll also say, partly by caricature, that that's almost tautologous. That's like saying wrong is wrong. Since we take for granted adultery is wrong, to say adultery is wrong is to say wrong is wrong. But they'll say, we're not fighting on that level. They'll say, certainly we agree that adultery is wrong. But on a material level, on the concrete level, they'll say that there is no way to spell out in concrete material terms any kind of action that is a good kind of action or a bad kind of action, because you must always leave open the possibility of some set of circumstances in which some greater good can be achieved, some commensurate reason can be fulfilled, and then what we would normally assume was immoral is actually not immoral, but Knauer says is a physical evil. Fuchs says is a pre-moral evil. Bruno Schüller says is a non-moral evil. Louis Janssens says is an antic evil. And Father McCormick says is a pre-moral disvalue. Now here we go with language. What's going on here? What's going on here basically is the whole notion of intrinsic morality is at stake. The whole understanding of objective morality is at stake. And if we're not careful, through some very erudite sounding language, we will end up, up to our eyeballs in situation ethics if we're not careful. Formal norm. Let's take McCormick's example. Adultery is wrong. He says he accepts that. He says he accepts that. But he says we cannot spell that out in concrete material terms. Well, I believe we can. Let's get down to the concrete. Sexual intercourse with the spouse of another is wrong. I have not snuck in any morally evaluative words on one side of that equation. Sexual intercourse is a significant kind of human activity. It can be described in objective terms. Some people sell books on this basis. With the spouse of another, this is another objective reference. The spouse of another presumes that there's a covenant of marriage. This was celebrated in public with public effects. I have snuck in no morally evaluative terms. On the other side of the equation, obviously I have, that is wrong. Now, Fuchs, McCormick, Schüller, all of them, they'll say that concrete material norm is generally a good kind of norm. And Fuchs will say it is virtually exceptionless. But it's not absolutely exceptionless, because you must always leave open the possibility that placing this action could bring about some greater good or some commensurate reason be fulfilled that brings about more good. Now what this really is a covert form of utilitarianism. That's what it really is. But it is phrased, particularly in dissenting Catholic circles, in traditional sounding terminology, and this whole list of authors, at least they claim, that they are only saying what the best of our tradition has always been saying up until now. Well, in fact, our tradition never said anything like this and condemned everything like this. But if we're not careful, we can be tricked. And this is the problem with commensurate reason, as they call it, or proportionalism, what you have obviously is an entirely subjective morality, because it is the subject who will determine what is a good or a greater good or a commensurate reason. It's also extrinsic. It presumes that there is no intrinsic morality to an action, but that an action will be really morally evil or merely physical evil, as they call it, or ontic evil, or whatever term you want to use. That will come about by consequences subsequent to it. So it's into ethical extrinsicism. But immediately you have the defeat, basically, of objective morality, and you could justify anything. To go back, I said that most of this came about, and I mean it seriously, by those who first dissented from the encyclical and the teaching of Humani Vitae. Why? Because in paragraph 14 of Humani Vitae, Pope Paul VI said something about artificial contraception being intrinsically evil. Intrinsece inhoneste, he said in Latin, which is verbatim exactly what Pope Pius XI said in Casti Connubii. Now, it's this notion of intrinsic morality. These people will say, well, artificial contraception always has some kind of a disvalue about it. There's something kind of wrong about it in general, but you must leave open the possibility that in a given set of circumstances, that it's not really morally evil if some greater good or proportionate good can be achieved. And then they stopped calling it moral evil, and they'll call it a physical evil, they'll call it an ontic evil, they'll call it a pre-moral disvalue, and so on. Now, this is actually a revolution principle. They said at first that this is contained merely to certain hard cases, limit situations, and conflict cases. But in fact, this dissenting logic, this revolutionary, new, unprincipled so-called principle, has millions of applications. That's one of the reasons we got to be careful with principles. Once you set aside a principle, you then cannot, of course, call that principle back to prevent certain things that you don't particularly like, if, in fact, you've changed your principles. And in the short time since Humani Vitae, since July of 1968, the same dissenting authors who said that this was such a narrow exception that they were alleging in 68, now one of them, for instance, Father McCormick, got on the bandwagon to permit sterilizations in Catholic hospitals. They say they have trouble figuring out when human life begins, but they see no really intrinsic moral reason to proscribe early abortions. Well, this is the problem with the new theory. It can't be confined just to a couple of exceptions. If you change your principle, then you change all your applications that are subject to the application of that principle. To his credit, Father Fuchs is the only one of these authors who admits that he's changing everything. He wrote an article in Gregorianum, which is a publication of the Gregorian University in Rome, in which he said that he was taking the conventional analysis of traditional Catholic moral theology, and he was saying something different. Most of the others, particularly the Americans, keep saying that, well, they're only saying what everyone has been saying all along. But this is not saying what everyone has been saying all along. It changes everything. Can it be refuted? It can be refuted not only on the level of principle, but I also think on the level of practical example. Can you think of any kind of activity, any type of activity, which under any circumstance or every circumstance would be considered wrong? And I was once dialoguing, that's a polite intellectual word for arguing. I was dialoguing with one of those authors, and I asked, well, let me put up a new principle. Let me say, it is always wrong to use federal government salaries to pay for your mistress. At the time, Speaker, he wasn't the Speaker, he was the Chairman of the House Ways and Means. Wilbur Mills was in a kind of tacky situation where it turned out that one of the ladies who was hired to type in his office did very little typing, but apparently other things, either in or out of the office. Now, it seems to me that that's a pretty fair principle. And the absurd answer I got back was, well, maybe this woman is using that money to build playgrounds for underprivileged children. And that would be causing some greater good. No, the point of the matter is, adultery is wrong, not only formally, but materially. And if it is adultery, and that's what it is, sexual intercourse with the spouse of another, that's what it is, no matter what the circumstances are, or the personal intention. It may have a greater or lesser degree of malice because of personal investment of intention, but that will not change what it is. And the authors of these opinions, yet they cannot concede to me that there is any kind of intrinsic morality, that there's any kind of human activity that is absolutely right or absolutely wrong, because if any kind of such activity exists, then their theory falls. I would give other examples, rape or arson, and I keep asking, when is rape the Christian thing to do? When is arson the Christian thing to do? I cannot think of a set of circumstances or concrete situations where rape or arson would bring about some proportionate good. And even if I could, or you could, and if someone has a fertile imagination, maybe they could think of such a thing, but will that make rape other than what it is? If we get back to the moral definition, the moral object of a kind of activity, that's the kind of activity it is. And now this notion of proportionalism or consequentialism, since it is really a general theory, obviously it can apply to everything. So what started back in 1968 as at least allegedly a dissent against a portion of the church's teaching, since it really was a change in principle, not to mention dissent and what that means in terms of ecclesiology, about believing what the church teaches, which also changes everything. But when you change that theory in the moral area, it can apply to everything. And it does come down to a form of subjectivism, in fact situationism, where if you think that you have a proportionate reason for doing what you're doing, then at least in your circumstance or in that concrete application, then that's really not wrong. Or they'll find another way to say not wrong. They'll say it's a mere physical evil, or it's an ontic evil, or it's a pre-moral disvalue, or it's a non-moral evil, or whatever. The words are many, and the words are fluid. But here we do have a revolution. It sounds like someone's tinkering with language, but they have actually carried through a revolution in principle, which can apply to anything, in fact, to everything. This has not gone unchallenged. Many other authors have criticized this, as they must, because situationism, normally all you have to do is turn the example around, and when the example hits you personally, I think you'll find something wrong with the problem. I mean, if someone were to take the wallet out of your pocket or out of your purse and inform you that they really did have a proportionate reason for doing what they're doing, I don't know if you'd be impressed personally with their reasoning. Normally what you do is you want your wallet back. In fact, you don't want to lose it in the first place, or for that matter, your purse. But the fact that someone says, well, this isn't really a moral evil, it's an ontic evil, I'm not into ontics. I want my wallet back because it's mine, it's not yours. And taking against my reasonable will is stealing. In the best of circumstances or the worst of circumstances, it is what it is. So, it sounds like, or at least its presenters allege, that they are only following through, they are only updating, they are only reforming the articulation of a very traditional double effect analysis in received Catholic moral teaching. But in fact, that's not what's going on. The double effect analysis, correctly understood, is a legitimate application of Catholic teaching. What some of these expansionists or revisionists have done is not, and it is very much at odds. And it becomes increasingly clear that it's not just a matter of a few exceptions. It becomes increasingly clear that we have really come into the point in some contemporary discussion of Catholic moral theology where some of this dissent is really totally unprincipled. It's either purely subjective or completely extrinsic. And as a matter of fact, just to stand things on their head, Father McCormick co-edited with Paul Ramsey a book called Doing Evil to Achieve Good, which was published by Loyola University Press. Let's try that again. doing evil to achieve good. That stands on its head, the very principle that the end doesn't justify the means. Because that's exactly what they're alleging. That you can do evil to achieve good, when in fact the principle says you can never do evil to achieve good. Now, of course, the trick is they're saying that, well, we're not really doing moral evil, we're doing non-moral evil, we're doing ontic evil, we're doing physical evil. And I had to get all those funny words because I have a proportionate reason for doing what I'm doing. Some of this is technical. Some of it seems to be going around in circles. It is. And my reason for saying there in the beginning, I still believe, and I firmly am convinced, that no Catholic author consciously wants to be labeled or categorized as situation ethics or situation ethician, if there is such a thing. But there are ways to end up in situation ethics without using that terminology, and I believe this is one way, because the guts of what situation ethics is about is really, there are no overall principles, or if there are, they're just mere formal principles. But in concrete material applications or circumstances, it really depends on how you look at it. It depends on what you want to achieve. And some of the criticisms that are lodged against the most traditional criticisms of the most traditional forms of utilitarianism on so-called greater good, you get into all sorts of arguments that just don't admit of a coherent explanation. Like when you talk about you're achieving some greater good, well, what's the good? The presumption there is that good can be measured as if it were quantity, and you get into the argument of the ripples in the pond. What counts as good? Immediate goods, long-term goods, century-long goods, who knows? You're trying to quantify what really can't be quantified, because it's not material that we're talking about, and that's often the mistake. There are certain goods, moral goods, truth, fidelity, indissoluble marriage, non-adultery. These are transcendent goods, and no amount of so-called concrete circumstances will change them or make them what they are not. They can be, because very often what we have in view is kind of that statue of Madam Justice, often before a federal court, standing there blindfold, holding a scale, a balance in her hand. But let's remember that the scales of justice supposedly measure facts, not goods. There's no way you can weigh, measure with a ruler the good of lifelong fidelity. You can't measure that. You can measure facts, if you will. And sometimes that business of even cost efficiency terminology, remember that's a very good technique for clarifying advantages and disadvantages. It's not a methodology for determining right and wrong, because efficiency rules there, and not necessarily here. Efficiency is good. So in some of the, it's been a long bit of a side road here, but the only reason I mention it, we don't do it all that fully, is because I suspect that a rather significant part of our Catholic population is either going to meet in the classroom or sometimes hear from the pulpit, and sometimes I suppose in the confessional or in other forms of moral instruction, or at least moral communication, because not all moral instruction turns out to be instruction. If the only operative criteria that comes up was kind of, did you have a proportionate reason for doing what you're doing, realize when you hear that type of terminology, you're really plugged into someone who has unplugged from traditional Catholic moral theory. It sounds like it's saying the same thing, and it may well be that I haven't done a good job explaining why they're saying different things. But that really is a revolution in principle, which turns out to be a fancily worded way of saying that the end does justify the means, provided that you are personally convinced that you are achieving some greater good, some higher good, or some commensurate reason, and then we change our terminology. So, on the level of principle, if its sources, moral object answers the question, what's going on here morally? Relevant moral circumstances, individual intention, And all that means is that when we're trying to figure out in general terms, as a kind or a class or a type of activity, whether an activity is good type or bad type, whether it is morally right or morally wrong, we simply maintain that there are kinds of activity stated in general terms, but grounded in verifiable evidence, which can be called good kinds of acts or bad kinds of acts. We're not saying very much more than or less than that we do some concrete thing in some concrete circumstances for a concrete reason. But that first determination, the first moral determinant, the moral object, that's the key to Catholic moral teaching, because that's intrinsic to the action, whereas the circumstances that surround it, by definition, are extrinsic, and obviously the personal intention of the agent that impels it or that places it is also extrinsic to the action. And that, combined with the traditional analysis for the application of double effect, for those situations that are not single instance but multiple resultancies. Remember, if we look at some very strange cases, we may end up thinking, this is very hard to understand. This is so arcane that you would have to be an archaeologist to figure it out. No. In large part, we admit there are some hard applications, precise ones, but in large part it is applied common sense. It tries to avoid two extremes. The extreme of not paying attention to consequences, as long as I have a nice intention, and the other extreme that I can't have anything to do with anything that results in evil in any way. So that the single purpose thing, object and circumstance, multiple results, the conventional double effect analysis. But I offer the caution, particularly in contemporary American circles, especially contemporary Catholic American circles, that there is no shortage of bogus theories that are packaged in very academic sounding language, which in fact do not represent Catholic teaching at all, because they depart radically from the principles and the principle base that we do find located in Holy Scripture, clarified in sacred tradition, and presented in any given age by the teaching church. Okay.